In September of 1925, Murnau begins filming Faust. The full resources of the UFA studios are put at his disposal. This film would revolutionize the art of special effects. To realize this film, Murnau not only had the necessary financial means, but was also given as much time as he needed. During the 6-month shoot, with 2 Parvo cameras, Murnau reshot several scenes multiple times. Murnau shot numerous takes of each scene, which were assembled into different negatives for worldwide release. The actors fanned themselves to try to cool off from the 120-degree heat generated by the lights, while Murnau repeated the shots time and time again. This short kissing scene took an entire day. Filming lasted until 10 p.m., since Murnau wouldn't stop until he had achieved a perfect result. The actors repeated the scene until they were exhausted. In December of 1924, Murnau presents his picture The Last Laugh in Hollywood. He visits Universal Studios, which will distribute the film. During this time, The Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney and Mary Philbin is in production. Murnau was searching for a Gretchen for his Faust film. Mary Philbin, who in Phantom appears as Gretchen in a scene from Gounod's opera Faust, seemed the ideal casting choice. In his film, Murnau integrated Gretchen's ascension from Gounod's opera. Because of contractual obligations, Mary Philbin could not take on the role. Murnau was also considering Lillian Gish or Greta Garbo for the part. Murnau's longtime friend Moritz Stiller had brought Greta Garbo to Hollywood. Murnau himself preferred Lillian Gish for the role of Gretchen. Finally, the role went to a 22-year-old unknown who had already stood in and showed her legs for lead actress Lil Dagover in Murnau's Tartuffe. The name of this unknown extra was Camilla Horn, who performed as a dancer in Rudolph Nelson's Revue Theater. Murnau had her do screen tests and initially planned to cast her in the small role of a sickly girl. But then it dawned on him that an aspect of Camilla's presence would fit the scene in which the mother was going to catch her with Faust. Murnau said, "This bashful expression should reveal her innocence." However, Murnau edited the scene in such a way that her expression was hardly visible. During rehearsal for this scene, Murnau dictated her every gesture.
He told me she looks at him and can't take her eyes off him. She forgets everything around her. Then she realizes that she's looked at him for a very long time and leaves.
Murnau adopted this approach throughout the film. He scripted Camilla Horn's every gesture. The scenes were repeated many times with different pacing. In her memoirs, Camilla Horn talks lovingly of Murnau.
I was fascinated by this man. I hung from his lips, was captivated by his eyes, and enveloped by his polite gestures. He determined every detail of my acting. I didn't play the role of Gretchen. I became Gretchen.
Murnau's script includes the following notes for this scene. Her thoughts were scattered. She can't concentrate on her prayers. She gets up. She now looks in timid fear at the chest of drawers. Will she walk over? It looks like it. She suddenly stops again, an expression of even greater helplessness on her face. What is she to do? She catches sight of the spinning wheel. Her face brightens. Yes, she wants to work, to forget all her thoughts. Thus she works, almost overdoing it, and she continues to spin. A few seconds pass. She works incessantly, on and on. Suddenly, she stops her work. She remains seated, pondering, almost like a child that doesn't know which way to turn. And now she spontaneously jumps up, runs to the chest, opens it, and takes out a necklace. She looks at it, joyous, and then again sulky with girlish spite towards the man.
Ich traf sie 1981 in Kassel und es war also sehr interessant, sich mit ihr zu unterhalten. Sie war noch sehr ähnlich wie damals in dem Film, aber und erzählte also begeistert aus ihrer Zeit mit Murnau. Sie liebte Murnau und sagte also, er wäre also der Mann gewesen, der ihr am meisten gefallen hätte und den sie geliebt hätte eigentlich.
But Murnau treated her ruthlessly. She was tied to a pole for hours and not given any food so that she would appear completely famished, or she would be chained to the set piece of the prison cell. She had to endure painful salt storms blown at her by fans, which dried out the skin of her face. A drawing in Murnau's script reveals how he conceived of Gretchen's ordeal.
Und sie schilderte dann auch, wie es zum Beispiel war, wenn er ihr erklären wollte, wie man Filmaufnahmen macht, beziehungsweise wie man weint. Und sie hat es also immer noch nicht richtig gemacht. Und er hat gesagt, also nun denken Sie doch endlich mal an etwas Trauriges. Hat ihr also Vorschläge gemacht, wo sie überall dran denken sollte, dass sie also in Tränen aufgelöst ist. Er wollte, dass sie also ganz natürlich weint. Und sie sagt, am Schluss hat sie also so geschluchzt, weil er ihr solche Beispiele angebracht hat, ja, dass sie also gar nicht mehr aufhören konnte zu weinen. Und dann hat er gesagt, na endlich, jetzt haben wir es.
In her memoirs, Camilla Horn talks about the ordeal she went through.
In the scene where Gretchen is brought to the stake, they drag me across the floor in real iron chains. We had to do lots of takes of the scene. And the extras cried when they saw me bleeding and at my wit's end. You can't see that in the film, but I adored Murnau.
For the role of Martha, Murnau chose chanteuse Yvette Gilbert, who had appeared at the Moulin Rouge in Paris at the beginning of the century. In later years, Gilbert taught acting in New York. Her singing career benefited from the Making of Faust in that she was enabled to perform a program of her own material in Berlin. She had been cast in Faust because of her surefire appeal to French audiences. This expensive film required an international cast. John Barrymore was initially considered for the role of Faust with the American market in mind. But then Murnau saw Victor Sjöström's Vem du mer. He traveled to Stockholm with an UFA representative to hire actor Gösta Ekman, who with different makeup was to play both the young as well as the old Faust. From the beginning, Emil Jannings was set to play Mephisto, a role he had before played on stage. Murnau asked Karl Mayr to write the script, but Meyer felt that he was not capable of adapting Goethe's verse for a silent film. Ufa then hired screenwriter and poet Hans Kaiser. However, Murnau didn't like the screenplay much and secretly revised it with his colleague Thea von Harbo. Robert Herold and Walter Roig designed the sets.
Ja, die wurden eben nach den Besprechungen, ging mein Vater nach Hause oder ging zusammen mit Röhrig nach Hause. Und dann stand er da an der Staffelei und hat diese Skizzen gemacht. Manchmal lagen sie auch auf dem Tisch, je nachdem, wie groß sie waren. Und damals, glaube ich, ist sehr vieles mit Kohle gemacht worden. In späteren Jahren hat er dann auch Pastell gemacht, aber da war, also ich erinnere mich so, ich sehe immer noch diese Kohlestifte, diese unterschiedlichen auf dem Tisch liegen. Und ja, und die wurden dann gezeigt und akzeptiert oder nicht akzeptiert. Und dann musste nochmal gearbeitet werden. Und dann waren sie fertig und dann ist sicher im Atelier noch sehr vieles geändert worden. Nicht? Bei der Arbeit wurde eben geändert. Murnau änderte bei der Arbeit viel. Und es war offensichtlich ganz spannend, weil er das ja dann zusammen mit dem Kameramann und den Architekten machte. Nicht? Alle machten die Änderungen gemeinsam.
Yet many of the sketches that are preserved in archives in Paris and Berlin aren't originals.
Dann nach dem Krieg kam aus Paris Lotte Eisner und fing an zu sammeln. Und sagte, haben Sie nicht Skizzen von Faust und haben Sie nicht Skizzen von Tartuffe? Und zu anderen hat sie anderes gesagt. Und ja, und dann hatten die Leute einiges und dann wurde das auch abgekauft. Das war eigentlich ganz erstaunlich. Die bekamen ja dann sogar Gelder vom französischen Staat in Paris, um das aufkaufen zu können. Und die waren auch damals die einzigen. Ja, weiß ich nicht, ob es überhaupt woanders schon Kinematheken gab. Es gab Sammlungen. Ne? Und dann hat Lotte Eisner gesagt, ja, aber ich hätte so gerne davon und davon noch was. Und dann machen Sie mir das doch noch mal. Und dann wurde das eben noch mal gemacht. Und es war auch so, dass sie dabei gesessen hat und zugeguckt hat. Und andere werden das sicher auch gemacht haben. Oder haben es auch gemacht. Ne? Und ich finde das auch sehr gut, denn sonst wäre ja alles verloren und untergegangen gewesen. Und so bleibt es eben doch auf diese Art für die Nachwelt erhalten.
Not only were the drawings duplicated, but some of the props as well.
Dieses Kästchen stand also, solange ich denken konnte, im Atelier meines Vaters und war für mich immer faszinierend, weil man es ja so öffnen konnte, ohne dass man das von oben sah. Eine Sache, die es eigentlich so viel ja sonst nicht gibt. Ich habe nie gewusst, ursprünglich habe ich gedacht, dass es das Originalkästchen aus dem Faust gewesen ist.
In the 60s, Robert Herold produced 2 recreations of sets from Faust, which are now kept in Berlin. One of the recreations shows a complicated scene which was rendered by using scale models, the flight over the mountains. On these drawings from the 1960s, one can see how the camera slides on tracks from one side to the other, gliding over an enormous recreation of the Alps, featuring plaster mountains and fiberglass clouds. One of the first sets depicts the roofs of the city from Faust. Another sizable model comprised a 35-meter set piece. A camera with an electric motor would zigzag on a small roller coaster in front of the model. In the process, the camera was shaking so violently that the scene had to be reshot again and again over the course of many days. Murnau used these reshoots to change details. He omitted, for example, the deformed oval sun, or changed the distance between camera and set piece. This footage was used to assemble different negatives for distribution of the film in Germany and abroad. Productions as expensive as Faust were exported globally, so hundreds of prints were made. Such mass production wore down the negatives over time, so that a reserve of negatives had to be created in order to ensure the production of additional prints. Today, negatives can be duplicated, but since material was too low quality for this purpose in the 1920s, several negatives had to be assembled instead. There exist at least 7 negatives of Faust. Murnau thought that Goethe would have favored the following scene, since it was most faithful to the original, and indeed the description in the screenplay could really come from Goethe. I see how one tree collapses onto another in raging motion, how they bend over the cliffs, how the wind blows and how the water runs down the long peaks of the cliffs. Rivers and creeks flow swiftly through the cracks and crevices in the rocks. But what do I hear? Is it a roar? Are they songs? Murnau chose the best shots for the German and the American negatives. From the remaining material, Ufer produced export negatives. Some of these negatives for distribution were also sent to France. Eventually, this negative with German and French intertitles came back to Berlin, where it was archived. It includes some very bad takes. In this shot, for instance, we see the arms of a technician holding the door. Here, Faust slips and is in danger of falling down. Gretchen trips over her own dress. And she trips again when she tries to get up. In a tight embrace with the Duchess of Parma, Faust strides ahead and bumps his head against the lamp. The fans blow the hat off a soldier's head. But in the following take, he wears the hat again. Gretchen's face appears ever closer over the mountains. But because of a mistake in the camera work, it becomes apparent that the mountains are a set piece. On the right, a thunderbolt strikes from which Mephisto emerges. This effect is missing on the left, so that Mephisto seems to be rising out of the ground. The thunderbolt is the greeting of bad spirits when they come to Earth, a thought that was drawn from the alchemist Paracelsus. Start of production on Faust, Ufer film number 631. The scene of the dying woman is being filmed. During the first days of filming, cameraman Karl Hoffmann and Murnau didn't get along. On the left side, we see the first take of the scene. On the right side, we see the same scene with substantial changes. Hoffmann used a lot of light, but Murnau wanted everything to be obscure, urging Hoffmann to work with shadows. Murnau deleted entire scenes and supporting parts. He wanted to include as much as possible in one shot. Here, for instance, he focuses on the action and on the person of Faust to dramatize the main idea of the scene. Here the backlight was changed to emphasize the woman's face. Murnau shot the same scenes several times to accommodate all types of changes. In this shot, Faust wears a dark coat, and in another one, a light garment. UFA had to provide to a wide network of distributors and needed many negatives of the film. Naturally, these negatives differed greatly from each other, not only in terms of acting and framing, but also in pacing and editing. In the left version, Faust seems not only immune to the cardboard stones which are hurled at him, but for no apparent reason, he seems to be expecting further abuse. To achieve parallel takes more easily, two cameras would record at the same time. A good example is this scene, in which all movements are identical, even though the framing differs. Shots recorded by two cameras simultaneously not only differed in terms of framing, but also with regard to speed, because they were shot with a hand crank, and each cameraman had his own pace. In this scene, Murnau decides to leave out the people entering the church. Here, Murnau opted for the shot on the right, featuring the milder snowstorm and the faster, more precise movements. These shots are derived from takes that had initially been rejected, but were inserted into the original in 1929 as replacements for scenes that had already gotten badly damaged. In the shot on the right, the snowflakes were omitted. Camilla Horn repeats the same gestures time and time again. The takes look alike, but if one looks closely at the shot on the left, it shows that the snowflakes are made of chicken feathers. Murnau reshot the scene without the feathers. This is a photograph of a lost shot. In the film, Mephisto appears towering over the city. For many of these takes, Jannings was replaced by a stand-in who had to endure clouds of coal dust and ammonia-infused smoke rising from the chimneys. The shots were repeated until they were perfect. On the left, we can see how the wing's shadow is projected over the backdrop. The bear on the left doesn't move anywhere. The one on the right attacks. But if one looks more closely, it becomes clear that the one on the left is a man in disguise. Murnau shot the scene again with a real bear. Murnau also changed the framing in the process of reshooting scenes. Here we can see Mephisto leading Faust into temptation, but Murnau only wanted to optically transpose Mephisto's voice without showing his face. he also repeated tricks. In this shot, which seems to be based on a painting by Felician Rops, a young woman slowly walks towards Faust on a badly disguised ramp. This scene looks so ridiculous that Murnau had to reshoot the scene. The ramp was removed, and now it looks as if the woman grows as the camera approaches. Murnau shot several versions of all takes of a scene. He didn't stick to a predetermined concept, but improvised a lot during filming. The various sections have a very different dramatic impact. In this scene, the appearance of Mephisto proves more frightening from a distance than in close-up. Murnau repeated tricks and techniques which he had successfully tested out in earlier films. In this scene, from The Last Laugh, the set was in fact a scaled-down replica. The inspector turns around in such a manner that he conceals several people with his body. The people behind him are actually wooden figures. In Faust, characters are similarly covered by a cross and by the hands of the priest. In another take, they are concealed by smoke. And in yet another one, hardly distinguishable in the luminosity of backlighting. These tricks were often repeated. From close by, it seems apparent that Mephisto's hands are positioned on top of each other, so Yanning's face doesn't get burned. In the faulty scenes, the hands are not positioned one on top of the other. And here we see the completed trick in the only successful take. This is a very simple trick. We can see that a string is simply being pulled. The scene was reshot with an enormous hand covering the string. This trick, on the other hand, was very complicated and had to be repeatedly tried over the course of several days. Hundreds of sheets of parchment were used. This take was shot with German text and in English for the American version. All books were furnished with German and English texts for the two versions. All takes with text were reshot for the American market, which Ufa tried to conquer with Faust. Murnau himself was very interested in the American version, since he had received an offer by William Fox to shoot a film in Hollywood. Faust was going to be his ticket to America. It was necessary to provide many copies of the books because single pages didn't turn smoothly in the fire scene. Stage designer Arno Richter recounts that Murnau himself ripped pages out so that the pages would turn more quickly. In some of the versions, one can detect the remains of these ripped pages. When the contract agreed upon with UFA, the Americans asked for an uncut negative so that they could assemble their own version of Faust. Murnau convinced Metro-Goldwyn to let him produce the version for the American market himself. Catherine Hilliker and H. Caldwell drew the intertitles in July of 1926, with a similar background to the one Murnau had inserted in the German version some months earlier. Murnau changed this version and adapted intertitles to play to the cultural background and viewing habits of the American audience. "It's a present from your cousin from Lombardy," Mephisto states in the German version. Murnau correctly assumed that Americans didn't know where Lombardy was. Therefore, the present is given by the Great Khan of the Tartars in the American version. In a different scene of the picture, Mephisto refuses a brew given to him by Lady of the Court Marta because his, quote, stomach is too weak for such a fiery drink. Murnau thought of something more appropriate for the Americans. Mephisto refuses the beverage because it contains alcohol, which he doesn't drink. In allusion to American prohibition, when it must have appeared funny that the devil would despise alcohol. And when Faust stalks Gretchen, Mephisto convinces Marta, the matchmaker, to let him be, because he is a blue-blooded prince. Murnau feared that the American audience might misunderstand this, and therefore in the US version, Mephisto says of his friend that he was, quote, as rich as Midas. Murnau considered shooting one scene that would only appear in the American version, but ultimately decided against it. Murnau had noted in his screenplay, quote, possible scene for America, Boccaccio scene. For the filming of special effects, a new film stock by George Eastman was used. Cameraman Charles Roscher, who had traveled to Berlin as an advisor, supervised duplication of the material. And sometimes, Murnau copied these duplicates again, as was the case with this take, into which he inserted text for the US version, for fear that the American audience might fail to understand the meaning of the images. After producer Eric Palmer left UFA, his successor, Alexander Grau, grudgingly discovered that Murnau had gone to the USA and had left in Berlin only the second best takes and a German version assembled from duplicates. He had taken the originals with him to America. Consequently, the best material of Faust was now held in Hollywood. Grau grew more irritated when Murnau stated that he was planning a move to America. The Film Courier warned all, quote, lovers of German cinema against Murnau's unpatriotic attitude. UFA had other problems with Murnau's work. He had shot the film at 20 frames per second and recorded the music to fit this speed. UFA decided to project Faust at a faster speed, namely at 24 frames per second, so that Murnau's music had to be changed. Such an approach was quite customary in those days. The Deutsche Kinemathek in Berlin holds a large number of photographs that show Murnau directing and instructing actors on facial expressions and gestures. Many of these photographs were shot by photographer Hans Notke, who had already collaborated with Murnau on The Last Laugh. During the shoot, cameraman Carl Hoffman also took some pictures of Murnau. Assistant set designer Arno Richter left us this drawing and a few documents from the shoot. Murnau experimented secretly. He didn't allow anyone into the studio, not even producer Eric Palmer. During production, Murnau had no sense of time. It took hours for him to realize that the Archangel was suffering so much from the heat generated by the lights that he no longer had the strength to hold his sword. Robert Chessex, a former colleague, left us these photographs and documents. His job consisted of scattering artificial flowers over Marta's garden and to eventually collect them again. Murnau expected everyone on the set to wear a darkly tinted monocle or dark glasses. That way, they could clearly see the scene, in spite of the flickering effect of the arc lamps, which made the eyes teary. These lamps emitted mercury, which cast a harsh green light on the sets. Chessex recounted, one had to be very hungry to be able to eat the ham sandwiches because they looked an unappetizing greenish black. But Murnau and the actors didn't seem to care. Here we see banker, actor and violinist Francesco von Mendelssohn paying them a visit. Workdays seemed interminably long. Chessex said that the scene with Marta had to be filmed more than 20 times, even after it had been rehearsed 30 times already. Taking into consideration that all takes were filmed with 2 cameras, one gets an idea of the amount of film stock that was being used to accommodate Murnau's requirements, even though only one of the many takes would end up being used. Sometimes, the differences between takes consisted of hardly noticeable changes of acting or pacing. But there were also more important changes. In this scene, there was a vase by the window, which was supposed to fall and wake up the mother. Murnau reshot this scene, but left out the vase, since the noise of the falling vase wouldn't make much sense in a silent film. Together with composer Erno Rappe, Murnau prepared the score for Faust, which was performed only once at the gala premiere of the film on August 25, 1926. The critics were not enthusiastic, and producer Hans Neumann commissioned Richard Heyman to compose a new score and hired Paul Hensel as director of music for the orchestral version. During the shoot, Murnau had played Bach's Matthew's Passion in order to make Camilla Horn cry. For the choir scene, he chose a psalm with music. Neumann changed the text of the psalm so that the music changed as well. For the arrival of the soldiers, Hensel chose Rossini's The Thieving Magpie. In the US, Gounod's Soldier Chorus from the opera Faust was used for this scene. For the Berlin premiere of the film, Ufa organized a competition for the best poster design. Among the many contestants was set designer Arno Richter. The contest was won by Kurt Lang and Carl Michael. The gala premiere took place at Ufa Palace am Zoo. Of the principal cast, only Camilla Horn attended. Murnau was filming in the US, and Jannings, who would arrive in Berlin a few days later, sent a cable from the ship he was on. Back then, gala premieres also took place on ocean liners. For this purpose, Ufa produced a bilingual version of Faust for German and American passengers alike. The English text was reworked, but inaccurately inserted. Hitherto omitted scenes, such as the one in which Jannings burns the parchment and takes his leave, were inserted. Playwright Gerhard Hauptmann was commissioned to set the intertitles to verse, but he didn't get the work done on time, so that the titles prepared by Murnau were altered. This intertitle drafted by Murnau was changed to the following.
Ich muss das anders sagen, als Murnau weg war, hat man angefangen, an dem Film rumzuschneiden. Murnau ist weggefahren, ich glaube nach Amerika, und war der Meinung, der Film ist so fertig und der kann aufgeführt werden. Und wie das ja in all den Jahren immer wieder mit Filmen passiert ist, zum Entsetzen der Mitarbeiter, es wurde dann hinterher daran rumgeschnitten. Sei es, dass es der Produzent wollte, sei es, dass es der Verleih wollte. Es sollte publikumswirksamer sein.
Murnau thought of Faust as his masterpiece. He had realized the dream that he had nourished since working with Max Reinhardt. At the time, he had taken part in Reinhardt's famous production of Faust as an actor, and now, as a film director, he emulated the master's staging. But above all, Faust was a painterly film. Murnau had studied illustrations for Faust. He was inspired by Moritz Rentsch's sculptures, such as this demon that looks as if he were catching the lovers in their embrace. This fresco by Kaulbach was probably the inspiration for the scene in which Faust conjures up the devil. Franz Stassen's illustrations, published in Berlin in 1920, were another source of inspiration for Murnau. His main inspiration, though, were the beautiful prints by August von Kralik, which gave the film a decadent, end-of-the-century touch. From these, he adopted poses and gestures, dramatic or playful ideas. But sometimes the origin of the images is not easy to determine. The scene of Gretchen in the snow could have been inspired by a drawing by Ludwig Richter, Morris von Schwind, or even by Rembrandt or Mantegna. It is more likely that he modeled the scene on Kathy Kollwitz's Gretchen scene, from which he also adopted the dramatic lighting, and had already drawn another scene. This sinister painting by Alfred Kubin undoubtedly inspired the unusual lighting pattern in this shot. Other models were prints by Max Klinger. And paintings by Franz von Stuck, who originated the idea of the demon with the glowing eyes. This painting by Caspar David Friedrich inspired Murnau to create the scene with the artificial moon in the background. The moon was made of tin, on which frontal light was projected. Yet the work of the set designers was no less significant than these influences. The magical aura of their creations exceeded the boundaries of the studio in which the film was shot. Even the lighting, poses, and figuration of the actors were meticulously calibrated. Based on illustrations chosen by Murnau, Robert Hurld and Walter Roeg developed brilliant models that created a world brimming with ingenious ideas, partially inspired by this Gustave Doré drawing, and realized with huge stuffed elephants which were pulled over hardly noticeable tracks. Murnau reverted to Rembrandt to depict a suffering Gretchen as the pained Virgin Mary. Christ's healing of Lazarus served as a model for the scene in which Faust is expected to miraculously cure the invalids. Faust is like the physician in Rembrandt's anatomy lesson. Until someone cries miracle. And everyone regards Faust as a miracle-performing, healing Christ. Murnau plays on the subconscious of an educated audience by reversing Christian motives from Rembrandt's paintings through demonic counter-images. Murnau carries the Faust-Christ comparison so far that not only plague victims, but also cripples are rushing to Faust in hope of a miracle. Concerned with lucidity and coherence, Murnau left the cripples out of the final act. Murnau and Jannings were amused by their diabolical idea of a connection between sinful Gretchen and Virgin Mary. We don't know to what extent Camilla Horn was involved in this notion. She died in August of 1996, mere days before she was scheduled to be interviewed. During the filming of Tartuffe and Faust, Murnau had tried to convince Uffe to shoot a film on Bali, where his friend Walter Spies was residing. In 1924, he had tried to meet up with Walter Spies on Java and shoot a film together. Since then, they had engaged in an intensive correspondence while Murnau supported Spies financially. In return, Spies sent some of his paintings to Murnau in Berlin.
Spies ging ja dann später nach Bali und das war also ein sehr schwerer Abschied, weil Murnau ihn also unheimlich vermisste. Spies war sehr fröhlich immer und brachte also sehr viel Leben ins Haus und das ist Murnau sehr schwer gefallen, dass er nun doch nach Bali ging. Spies hat dann sie haben dann ausgemacht, dass Murnau nachkommt und hat dann die Gemälde, die er dann für Murnau malte, hat er abfotografiert und auf der Rückseite draufgeschrieben, wie die Gemälde sind, welche Farben sie haben und überhaupt kurz darüber berichtet. Und diese Berichte schickte er Murnau in die Südsee, damit er Bescheid wusste. Und die Bilder gingen dann schon nach Deutschland. Ich vermute, dass das Geld, was er immer überweisen ließ von seiner Sekretärin, dass das für die Bilder war. Ja?
Spies, who was himself a dancer and musician, decided to study the dance of the natives and indefinitely settled on Bali.
Das ist ein besserer Selbstmord gewesen, denn da war ja nichts. Nicht? Aber er wollte nicht nach Europa zurück, gar nicht. Damals war hier noch, kamen die Nazis, alles und sowas. Also es war ihm alles sehr unsympathisch.
Spies opened a museum and in 1928 served as an advisor on a film about Balinese heritage. Years before, he had convinced Murnau to shoot a film on Bali together. Murnau once again tried to convince producer Eric Palmer to engage in this venture. But Palmer was not interested in Bali and had set his sights on the US, where Lubitsch was already successful. Palmer had traveled to New York and Hollywood with Fritz Lang and had negotiated with Paramount the distribution of Metropolis, an incredible superproduction inspired by huge ocean liners. A big artificial city of rich loafers, supported and sustained by below-deck workers. Some of the special effects were not new inventions, but mere variations on effects from Murnau's Faust. Like Palmer and Lubitsch, Murnau also decided to further his career in the U.S. On June 22, 1926, he left Bremen for New York.